My name is Peter Miles, and I'm a professional mediator. My job is to step into conflicts, often messy and emotional, and help people avoid the financial and personal wreckage of court battles. I'm hired by legal firms to guide parties, businesses, families, couples, toward compromise and understanding. It's a delicate balance of vulnerability, empathy, and strategy. Mediation became my calling long before I knew it could be a career. Growing up as one of 5 kids, I was the unofficial referee. Our dad passed away when I was young, leaving my mom to raise us alone while working full-time. As latchkey kids, we were left to figure out a lot on our own, and our home was often loud with arguments. I instinctively took on the role of peacemaker, diffusing fights and keeping the peace. Those early days shaped me. I learned that most conflicts boil down to people feeling unseen or misunderstood. After high school, I started college as a creative writing major and worked at a factory to pay my way. Even there, I found myself mediating, settling disputes between frustrated workers and overworked managers. When an arbitration company brought me in for a labor dispute, it clicked. I switched my major to business, added a psychology minor, and never looked back. Over the years, I've handled cases ranging from tense corporate standoffs to deeply personal family breakdowns. But mediating between strangers is one thing. Handling conflict in your personal life is another. Ruth, my wife, has always been the love of my life. Beautiful, intelligent, and magnetic, she captured my heart the day we met. After 12 years of marriage, I thought I knew her better than anyone else. I thought I understood her completely. We didn't have children, a fact that shaped our relationship in ways we had to work through together. Ruth's health complications made it impossible for her to conceive, and though we explored surrogacy, it never felt right for us. We grieved the family we couldn't have, but we didn't let it define us. Instead, we traveled the world, running with bulls in Spain, diving in Pearl Harbor, and bungee jumping off the Sydney Harbor Bridge. Our life together felt rich and full, even as our friends with kids drifted away. Their priorities changed, while Ruth and I leaned into our freedom. We built a life we loved, filled with laughter, weekend getaways, and long evenings spent together in our condo overlooking downtown Bellevue. I always believed we were happy. Sure, we had our share of arguments. Ruth's sharp tongue and my stubbornness meant we clashed often. But I never doubted that, at the core of it all, we were solid. A team. That belief was shattered one evening when I walked into our home and found another man sitting on my couch. It wasn't just his presence, it was Ruth's demeanor. Her nervous, guilty expression. The way her body language leaned toward him, despite the effort she made to appear distant. The beer in his hand, my beer. In my line of work, I read people for a living. I understand the subtleties of posture, tone, and what someone's not saying. That night, I didn't need words to piece it together. Something was happening between them. Something that had no place in my marriage. When I walked into the condo that evening, something felt off immediately. The lights were on, and Ruth was sitting on the couch, her posture unusually tense. She wasn't alone. Beside her was a man I'd never seen before, younger than me, casually reclined with an air of confidence that didn't belong in my home. His arm rested along the back of the couch, just behind Ruth, who leaned forward slightly, as if trying to put space between them without being obvious. Ruth's face told me everything I needed to know. She looked nervous, guilty, and strangely resolute, like someone who had braced herself for impact. Her body language, the way her hands twisted in her lap, the way she avoided direct eye contact, was all too familiar. As a mediator, I'd seen this countless times before. The unspoken tension, the anxious energy of people caught in a situation they can't easily explain. I stood there for a moment, frozen. The pieces fell into place almost instantly. Ruth's demeanor, the man's overconfidence, the half-empty beer in his hand, my beer. It was clear that this wasn't just a casual visit. I didn't yell or demand answers right away. Instead, I moved with practiced calm, setting down my jacket and grabbing a drink from the fridge. If this was going to be a confrontation, I wanted to remain in control. But as I sat down in the armchair across from them, every ounce of training I had in conflict resolution was drowned out by the raw emotions swirling in my chest. I couldn't help but notice the subtle details. Ruth's knees were pressed together, her shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to make herself smaller. She kept biting her lip, a nervous habit I knew all too well. The man, by contrast, was at ease, almost too at ease. He leaned back as if he owned the place, his expression hovering between fake concern and quiet arrogance. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably. Ruth seemed to be waiting for me to speak, but I didn't. I wasn't about to make this easy for her. She shifted in her seat, glancing at the man beside her as if hoping he would take the lead. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. Her words came haltingly, laced with guilt and fear, as she confessed to having an affair. The man's name was Scott, and he wasn't just some passing fling. For the past 6 months, Ruth had been seeing him behind my back. Her explanation came in fragments, each one more painful than the last. It just happened, she claimed. She insisted that it wasn't about me, that I hadn't done anything wrong. She still loved me, always had, always would. This, she explained, was something separate, a new dimension to her life that didn't diminish her feelings for me. It was a story I'd heard before, not from Ruth, but from countless clients who sat across from me in mediation sessions. The justifications were always the same. It wasn't planned. It doesn't change how I feel about my partner. It doesn't mean I love them any less. But now, hearing those words from Ruth, they felt like knives twisting in my chest. As I sat there, listening to her unravel the details of her betrayal, my mind raced with questions I couldn't bring myself to ask aloud. How had this started? Was it an emotional connection that turned physical, or was it the other way around? Had there been moments, small, seemingly insignificant moments, when she had lied to my face without a second thought? I felt sick. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was Ruth's expectation that I would accept it. She genuinely believed that we could move forward, that nothing fundamental about our marriage had to change. She loved me, she said, and she loved Scott too. It was just different, that's all. I'd mediated enough infidelity cases to know that people often say things like this to avoid facing the full weight of their actions. They minimize the betrayal, downplay the damage, and convince themselves that it's possible to have their cake and eat it too. But I wasn't one of my clients, and this wasn't a professional dispute. This was my life, my marriage, my trust being torn apart. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Ruth didn't truly grasp the enormity of what she'd done. In her mind, this wasn't a betrayal, it was an expansion of her life. She believed she could compartmentalize her feelings for Scott and keep our marriage intact. She was trying to sell me on a version of reality where nothing had changed. But everything had changed. As Ruth spoke, I felt a cold, simmering anger begin to rise. Not the explosive kind of anger that makes you lash out, but the slow, controlled kind that sits in your chest like a weight. I could feel it in the way my hands tightened around the beer bottle, in the way my jaw clenched as I forced myself to keep listening. 6 months. 6 months of deceit, of stolen moments, of lies I hadn't even realized were being told. I thought back to the times Ruth had gone out late, claiming she was meeting friends, or the nights she'd seemed distracted but brushed it off as work stress. Each memory now felt tainted, warped by the knowledge of what she'd been hiding. Ruth's confession ended with an appeal to my understanding. She wanted me to see things from her perspective, to accept this new arrangement as though it were a reasonable compromise. She even said she believed I could handle it, that I was strong enough to adapt. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the woman I thought I knew. The woman who had once promised to be faithful to me, to love me and only me. The woman who now sat across from me, asking me to share her with someone else. What struck me most wasn't her words, but her tone. She genuinely believed she was being reasonable. She thought she was offering a solution, a way to keep our marriage intact while pursuing this new relationship. She didn't see it as the betrayal it was. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't recognize her. The room felt suffocating. Ruth was still talking, her voice shaking with emotion, but I couldn't focus on her words anymore. My thoughts were a storm of rage, heartbreak, and disbelief. I knew I wouldn't get through the night without confronting her fully, but for now, I just needed to breathe. The room had become unbearably quiet after Ruth's confession. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside. I sat there, unmoving, my thoughts a tangled mess of pain, anger, and disbelief. Across from me, Ruth fidgeted on the couch, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She looked at me like she was waiting for a verdict, but what she didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, was that there was no verdict that would save us. Whatever we were before this night, it was gone. Her words echoed in my mind, fragments of justification that only deepened the ache in my chest. I didn't mean for this to happen. I still love you. You're not losing anything. But those weren't truths, they were excuses. I'd spent my career navigating human conflict, cutting through lies and half-truths to find the core of an issue. Ruth might have believed she was offering me a way forward, but all I could see was the wreckage she had created. 6 months. For half a year, she had lived a double life. While I'd been picking up flowers for her, planning weekend getaways, and believing in the strength of our marriage, she'd been building something else, something I was never meant to be a part of. And then there was Scott. The man who'd walked into my life uninvited, his presence a glaring reminder of Ruth's betrayal. His relaxed posture, the way he'd sat on my couch drinking my beer, spoke volumes about his sense of entitlement. He was the kind of man who inserted himself into another man's marriage without a second thought. My anger simmered, a slow, burning heat that pulsed with every breath I took. "You don't understand," Ruth had said. Oh, but I did. I understood more than she realized. She thought she could have both worlds, that she could compartmentalize her feelings and keep everything intact. She thought I would agree to share her, to bend and accommodate her new desires like this was some kind of negotiation. But there are some things you can't negotiate. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled, though every muscle in my body ached to lash out. Ruth watched me carefully, her eyes widening as if she expected me to explode. But I didn't. Not yet. "You need to leave," I said finally, my voice low and steady. Her face crumpled in shock. "Peter, no. Please, let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my tone ice cold. "You made your choice, Ruth. And it wasn't me." Her tears came fast, streaking her face as she pleaded with me. "You don't mean that." "I love you, Peter. This doesn't change how I feel about you." But it did. It changed everything. I turned to Scott, who had remained silent since I told him to shut up. He was sitting stiffly now, looking unsure of himself. "Get out," I said, my voice sharp. He hesitated, glancing at Ruth for guidance. That hesitation only fueled my anger. "You've overstayed your welcome, buddy," I added, taking a step toward him. Scott stood quickly, grabbing his jacket. Ruth reached for him, but he shook his head and mumbled something under his breath before heading for the door. I followed him, making sure he left, the door slamming behind him with a satisfying finality. When I turned back to Ruth, she was standing in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small, fragile, and for a fleeting moment I felt a pang of guilt. But it passed quickly, replaced by the overwhelming weight of betrayal. "You think I can just accept this?" I asked, my voice rising. "You think I can share my wife with another man like it's some kind of compromise? Do you even hear yourself, Ruth?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," she repeated, her voice breaking. "Stop saying that," I yelled, my composure finally cracking. "You didn't trip and fall into this. You made choices, Ruth. Every lie, every secret, every moment with him. You chose this." She sobbed harder, her hands covering her face. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said through her tears. "But you did," I said, my tone cutting. "You destroyed everything we had. And for what? For him? For someone who couldn't even look me in the eye." Ruth dropped her hands, her expression shifting from sorrow to defiance. "You don't understand how hard this has been for me," she said. "You don't understand what it's like to feel so torn, so split between two people you care about." I laughed bitterly. "No, Ruth, you don't understand. You don't understand what it's like to trust someone completely, to believe in them, only to have them shatter that trust into pieces. You don't understand what it's like to come home and find out the life you thought you had was a lie." Her defiance wavered, and she took a tentative step toward me. "Peter, please," she said softly. "I love you. I've always loved you. We can get through this." I shook my head, my anger giving way to exhaustion. "No, Ruth. You might be able to live with this, but I can't. You want both of us, but I can't share you. I won't." Her tears returned, but I didn't offer comfort. I couldn't. There was nothing left to give. "Leave," I said finally, my voice flat. "What?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You heard me," I said. "Pack your things and go. I'll send you the divorce papers." Her sobs turned into quiet, broken sounds as she realized I was serious. She stood there for a moment, as if waiting for me to change my mind, but I didn't. This was the end. After Ruth left, the silence in the condo was deafening. I sat in the same armchair, staring at the spot on the couch where she'd been moments earlier. The air still carried her faint perfume, a cruel reminder of everything that had just unraveled. I didn't move for a long time. My mind was a storm of emotions: anger at Ruth's betrayal, shame at my own naivety, and grief for the life I thought we'd built together. But beneath it all was an aching hollowness, a realization that nothing would ever be the same. I glanced around the room, taking in the details of our life together: the framed pictures on the walls, the bookshelves we'd filled over the years, the silly knickknacks we'd picked up during our travels. Everything felt tainted now, as if those memories belonged to someone else. The clock on the wall chimed, marking the passing of another hour. It didn't matter. Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I stood up, grabbed the bottle of vodka from the kitchen counter, and poured myself a drink. Then another. And another. The alcohol burned, but it dulled the edges of my thoughts, numbing the pain just enough to keep me from screaming into the empty room. The condo felt like a stranger's home now, a museum of a life that no longer existed. Every corner held a memory: the balcony where we used to sit with wine on warm summer nights, the kitchen where she'd teased me for my terrible cooking, the bedroom where we'd shared both our most intimate moments and our deepest arguments. But those memories were ghosts now, haunting the space and mocking me with their permanence. I thought about what Ruth had said, that she still loved me, that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. The words echoed in my mind, hollow and meaningless. Love wasn't supposed to feel like this. Love wasn't supposed to destroy you. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself, or the fact that she genuinely believed I could accept it. That I would somehow find a way to share her, to let her continue her relationship with Scott while keeping our marriage intact. But love isn't a compromise. It's not something you can split between two people. And for all her talk about wanting to keep our life together, Ruth had already made her choice. She just didn't want to face the consequences. As the hours dragged on, I thought about what came next. I knew I couldn't stay here, not in this place, surrounded by reminders of what I'd lost. I would need to start over, find a new apartment, build a new life. But how do you rebuild from something like this? How do you move forward when the foundation of your life has been ripped out from under you? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that the man who walked into this condo earlier that evening wasn't the same man sitting here now. Ruth's betrayal had changed me. I knew there would be more pain to come. The divorce, the awkward conversations with family and friends, the long nights spent alone with nothing but my thoughts. But I also knew I couldn't let this define me. I would grieve for the life I'd lost, but I wouldn't let it destroy me. For now, though, I poured another drink and let the numbness take over. Tomorrow could wait. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to my YouTube channel for more stories, reflections, and insights into navigating life's hardest moments.